So the topic for today is going to be on the beginning origins of British Columbia, a history that is fascinating because it includes a combination of First Peoples, the fur trade, gold rush, exploration, and really when you look at the history of the province or before the colony or the territory of British Columbia, you can really see a lot of connections of various other historical events happening all over either North America or even some into Europe, and how it is connected to British Columbia. BC really is like a nugget in history. You just need to know how to search and locate the history, and then once you do, it is fascinating what you find. So let's get started. Geographically, British Columbia in the Pacific Northwest was the last part of North America to be explored and settled by Europeans. However, the first people, the Aboriginal history, has been here for more than 18,000 years. That being said, the HBC, so the Hudson Bay Company, didn't want any settlement in this territory as the company feared it would disrupt the very lucrative fur trade. As the territory in the colony, BC was the last major area for the fur trade for the company after the events of the Northwest Rebellion and the construction of the railway with the government's national policy of bringing settlers and farmers into the Canadian prairies. It was part of John A. Macdonald's national plan. But in the Pacific Northwest, it had also been territory which was claimed by the Americans, British, French, as well as the Russians. A bit of an overview of this area. You can see the unique geographical characteristics. Obviously includes British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Northern California, even to a certain degree too, the Yukon. But you can see on this map, you can see the spine of the Rocky Mountains, that continental spine, and the coastal mountains or even the Sierra Nevada in California. For other things about geography, it's good to look at and be aware of the First Peoples. And you can see on this map, these are the various territories, ancestral territories that just the coastline of British Columbia holds, from the Haida-Gwaii, Nuu-Chutneth, Stalos, Squamish, Haisla, to mention the Nisga'a, the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka'wakw, and so on. It is actually the culture, the First Peoples culture and history in the Pacific Northwest is definitely a fascinating and very ancient. Additionally, with the Pacific Northwest, the region's biggest cities are Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland, with Seattle being the biggest. But not only because of companies such as Amazon, Starbucks, or even Boeing all having their major headquarters there. In the Pacific Northwest, too, it does stretch from Alaska to California. It was a major part of the Pacific Rim trade, and it is also the world's largest temperate rainforest for an ecosystem. So, like the history and the geography, the climate is also incredibly diverse in this last area to be settled and explored by the Europeans. Now, with the First Peoples, it was an area that had been occupied for almost, give or take, about 18,000 years, and it was believed that they moved from the Northeast Asia to America via the land bridge, Maringia, the land bridge between Alaska and Kamchatka, Russia, during the last ice age when the water level was low enough, and so those two land masses were connected. And because of that, but only not because of that, there was the incredible richness of the Pacific Northwest in their history and culture because of the fisheries and the incredible amount of food that existed here. And historically, there were some of the most complex cultures that can be found here. Living in large villages, towns, they built plank houses and large canoes. This is an example of a Stalo village in the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. Now, it's good to highlight a couple. One are the Haida. Now, the Haida territories comprise of the archaeological islands of the Crenshaw Islands, though it is now referred to as the Haida Gwaii Islands. But the Haida were ruthless warriors, they were slave traders, and they would have raiding parties up and down the BC coast and would trade and raid all the way down as far as California. They would use western red cedar for the canoes, for the totem poles, and create longhouses. And this, in the photograph, you can see what their a typical Haida village once looked like. For the Chutnoth, their traditional home is along the west coast of Vancouver Island. Basically, the West Coast Trail is a famous location as part of their territory. Now, amongst the first peoples, they are believed to be the first ones on the West Coast to have come in contact with Europeans because of the whaling and how the whales was an essential part of their culture and their spirituality. Then there's also the Coast Salish. And the Coast Salish traditional territory ranged from southern Vancouver Island all the way to Tillamook, Oregon. Now, recognize the name? It's famous for its cheese. But the Coast Salish communities are over 60 different communities. Many towns and cities have their traditional names named after. And while they are related, each community or tribe was different. It's like saying, for Coast Salish, saying someone is European. While true, and especially in a geographical sense, not all Europeans are the same. You have British, French, Germans, Italians, and so on. So that's the same idea with the style. Yet, while they have the same sort of a general generic name, each one is still very much unique and different unto itself. But with the Europeans' initial exploration, a British captain, also privateer, which really we know that just means a pirate, Francis Drake, may have sailed off of Oregon's coast around 1579. But a lot of things about the Drake's expedition is questionable. But by the late 1700s, Russian settlers had established several posts and communities that reached as far as south as California. In 1776, the British mariner, the Captain James Cook, arrived in Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island and may have voyaged as far as Alaska. And there was various Spanish expeditions all up and on the coast of British Columbia as well as Alaska. So there was definitely some exploration and a European presence was known here. A very famous explorer was Captain George Vancouver, the person that the city is named after. And Vancouver's orders included to survey every inlet and outlet on the west coast of the mainland all the way to Alaska. Most of his work was done by small boats, powered by both oars and sails. And while he was the first European to enter Burrard Inlet, and so he named it after his friend Sir Harry Burrard. A friend also being he was the person who paid for the Vancouver expedition. And with Vancouver, he cooperated with the Spanish expedition. It is widely believed, though no records exist, that he met with a Spanish expedition led by Daniel Alessa Galeano and Caledonia Valdez del Foray. He was mortified, in his own words, to learn that they had already created a crude chart of the Strait of Georgia the year before he had arrived. And so the two different exploration parties agreed to cooperatively work together for 3 weeks and cooperatively explored the Georgia Strait and the Discovery Islands before they're going their own separate ways and sharing their research with each other. If you've ever noticed, a lot of the southern Gulf Islands here are actually named after Spanish names as Saturna, Galiano, Quadra, to name a couple, are not English names. They're not First Peoples names. They are, in fact, Spanish names. And this is the kind of picture that depicts the exploration here. You can see the Mount Baker is in the background to give you sort of like that geographical meaning. But you can see one side Spanish, the English or the British exploration, and then the first peoples. Actually, on the most southern point, East Point on Secretary Island, is where the meeting took place. Same one looking south. Actually, it's geographically or even geologically, this is actually is a really interesting location because these rocks are weathered and eroded away because of the wind and the ocean salt spray. This actually is a really neat location to visit. Now, some of the legacies of Vancouver's navigation legacy is that he determined that the coordinates that he was provided for the possible mouth or the end point for the Northwest Passage was not here in the Pacific Northwest, as that was another part of his goals. And also with his legacy, his charts are so extremely accurate that they could serve as a key reference for coastal navigation for centuries and for generations. Even though he had no fancy type of equipment, he just observed and recorded what he had seen from the boats. But even though he knew about the Columbia River and the mighty Fraser River, he failed to realize the size and the scope of those rivers there. So it is interesting to know that difference. And one person has said too that Vancouver put the Northwest on the map. He drew up a map on the Northwest coast that was so accurate to the 9th degree to the point it was still being used in the 20th century as a navigational aid, which was extremely unusual for maps, especially once sonar and radar became available. But Vancouver, like many other explorers, his expedition did not end well. It actually ended badly because in his case he was murdered in Hawaii, even though Hawaii was very much a common place for explorers to go winter over during their expedition. Actually, in our other sets of notes, we will talk about how the actual expedition, while it had some good start, it really had a bad ending, with very few actual survivors making their way back to Britain. Another really influential but indirect connection to the Pacific Northwest was the American Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, the Lewis and Clark expedition was the only second official transcontinental crossing that had been done in North America that was north of Mexico. And while the Canadian expedition that was led by the explorer Sir Alexander Mackenzie had previously across North America in 1789, but it turned out to just across the actual continental divide. Whereas the Lewis and Clark expedition was the American expedition and really strengthened a lot the Americans' claim to the West Coast and the overall manifest destiny much more. And the Lewis and Clark expedition has become very much a big part of the American mythology, even though it was funded by the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. But because of the Louisiana Purchase, which came because of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Americans had the Louisiana Purchase because of the expedition. And the Louisiana Purchase was when the United States bought about 2.1 million square kilometers of land from the French, Napoleon there. And the Louisiana Purchase, it was so big, it really covered 15 states and portions of 2 Canadian provinces there. But the purchase was necessary because it would stop France and Spain from having power to essentially block the American access to the port of New Orleans there. So you can see on this map how big that Louisiana Purchase was, but how it relates to BC, British Columbia, though, is that because this territory purchase, it gave the Americans a much more greater influence into the Oregon Territory, which is now part of BC there, and there was more of an American influence rather than a Canadian influence early on. From the Lewis and Clark expedition, Thomas Jefferson had long thought that such an expedition was not really possible because it might have been too dangerous, but eventually it was allowed, and it was there to study the various communities, the botany, the geology, and the western terrain and wildlife in the region. While at the same time, the expedition was there to evaluate the potential interference that the British or the French might have provided to possible coming American settlers into the West there. But it did begin at the end of August from Pittsburgh. And as you can see for this expedition, where it started there, and in a couple of years crossed over all that territory into eventually into, well, basically Astoria, Oregon today. And from the expedition, the Americans gained extensive knowledge of the geography of the West. They observed many more new types of plants and animal species. It opened up American diplomatic relations with the first people there, and it strengthened the claim to the Oregon Territory because of what the expedition and the influence and the knowledge it had brought. Because recall, the Oregon Territory is what is part of the Pacific Northwest for the BC, and this was the last area to be settled by Europeans, as it was influenced by American, British, French, and Russians, even to a little bit the Spanish as well. But going further, right, the Oregon Territory was a disputed territory, and actually it's in the map where it says 5440. That was the line the Americans had originally had claimed as all part of their territory. Beyond this map, though, the British had claimed all the way down to the 42nd latitude line. So the Oregon Territory was definitely disputed territory in North America. But with the Oregon, there was the Oregon Treaty, which is also known as the Treaty of 1818 or the Boundary Treaty. Essentially, it set the United States and British North America border on the 49th parallel, the same border line that had been established after the War of 1812. With all the channels and straits south of the 49th parallel remain free open to travel on both sides. And the rights of Hudson Bay Company and the British subjects could travel between both sides respectively for it. After kind of the treaty, the first actually a colony in the area was actually not on the mainland, it was a colony of Vancouver Island. And an obscure little historical reference, but Vancouver Island was a crown colony of British North America from 1849 to 1866 there, and it was officially known as the Island of Vancouver and its dependencies, basically the surrounding islands around Vancouver Island. And with the establishment of the colony, the American president also had a little slogan of 5440 or fight, which was part of the whole disputed kind of territory, which eventually would lead to the 49th parallel be given to everything south of the 49th being American, everything north of the 49th being British, eventually Canadian there. But the British government felt that they needed to have a stronger presence than just a bunch of Hudson Bay Company fur trading for it to mix around the territory. So the company determined that their fur routes were going to be endangered there, which will kind of push for the actual establishment of the colony there. And so the first governor of the colony was Sir James Douglas, and James Douglas was both a local chief executive of a private company as well as a civil governor of a colony. Basically, James Douglas ran the company and he also ran the colony, which normally under today's would be very much like a conflict of interest, but he back then though he did do that, and needless as you can imagine, It was a very much a very fine balancing act of encouraging settlement, raising a militia there for the colony to get settlers and an economy while still trying to maintain the fur trade and the interests of the company. And one strategy he did was he established various sawmills and coal mining operations in locations such as Fort Nanaimo or Fort Rupert. Today it's Port Hardy there. And but yet, though, keeping the interests of the company at heart, he did make it so the land prices were extremely high on Vancouver Island. So only the wealthiest of the wealthiest British would ever come to the island, which did succeed in limiting the overall population and kind of keeping more or less like a peace with the first people to live on the island. He was unable to stop the landless laborers that were fleeing from the United States and coming up to British Columbia in search for gold. Here's an example of what a local coal mining operation in Nanaimo would look like. There's the town of Nanaimo. This is around the end of the 19th century. Some of the areas that actually are former coal mines are parks, but because of plate tectonics and other geological activity, there's been cracks that have occurred. Fort Victoria was the headquarters of the HBC in British Columbia, but it will eventually grow into nowadays provincial capital city. But it really has struggled to develop any sort of profit because of its geographical location. But despite it also being like a two-tiered of a location and dual purpose, it very much had that typical Hudson Bay Company Fort feel to it. If anyone's ever been to spots such as Fort Langley historic site, you would recognize the similarities in the overall design. But what would make the change would come when the colony would have news revealed of gold. And even though there's about 30,000 first people who lived on the colony of Vancouver Island, there was 14 different separate treaties and communities that were they all agreed to surrender the land title with the exception of villages and certain areas. By 1857, American British colonists began arriving because of rumors of gold being discovered along the Thompson River. And then once the knowledge came public of gold in New Caledonia, the mainland, overnight between 10 to 20,000 men would move into the interior of BC, and Victoria was basically transformed into this tennessee of prospectors and merchants and land agents and even speculators. There, the gold rush, beginning part of the gold rush, would change everything for this area, change it from the first people's point of view, the fur trade, it changed everything. And so the last governor I feel is kind of interesting to note is Sir Arthur Kennedy. He was successor after James Douglas, but Kennedy, unlike Douglas, was a colonial career administrator whose previous terms in Australia and Africa. Kennedy was not really associated at all with the Hudson Bay Company, which at that time was definitely viewed more of a positive because the company was definitely facing lots of backlash there. Kennedy was definitely the last governor of the colony, and Kennedy would see the end of the colony of Vancouver Island, as the colony of Vancouver Island had no authority over the New Caledonia territory, and New Caledonia is what the mainland of British Columbia was kind of referred to as. And Kennedy wanted to unite the island with the mainland, but it was constantly being troubled because of colonial administrative stuff. But the idea of unionizing, so joining the island and the mainland together would boost the failing economy of the island there, as like in 1865, basically the economy of the island had collapsed. there. So eventually, the unification of the mainland to New Caledonia and Vancouver Island would take place, and the original capital would be in New Westminster. Yeah, and the declaration for the colony of British Columbia was made from the big house at the Hudson Bay Company Fort in Fort Langley in 1858 there. And that was because the influx of American prospectors in the New Caledonia territory there, which was because of the gold rush that was now underway in the Fraser Canyon. And this is the view of what the Fraser River, New Westminster, looked like as the first capital in 1865.